Today's webinar presentation is Adapting Forest, Changing Conditions, Tools and Approaches for Natural Resource Professionals. Our presenter today is Maria Janowiak. Maria is a Deputy Director of the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science with the USDA Forest Service. Her work focuses on translating science related to climate change and forests into usable information, resources, and tools for forestry and conservation professionals. She coordinates the New England Climate Change Response Framework, where she's leading a climate change vulnerability assessment for New England's forest, and works with natural resource professionals and woodland owners to develop real-world examples of climate change adaptation in forests and other ecosystems. Maria is a forester by training, with a BS in forestry and an MS in forest ecology and management from Michigan Tech. We're pleased to have Maria join us this morning, and with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Thanks, Maria.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining today. It's really great to see all of you on the line, and I appreciate your participation and interest. What I want to talk today about is the work that we're doing to provide resources and tools for helping land managers consider how to integrate climate change considerations into their natural resource management, into their work. And so we know that as foresters, we consider a whole range of things when we think about the work that we want to do in the woods. You know, when we go out to write a management plan, do an inventory to think about what we're going to do in a particular place, we have a huge list of considerations in our mind, and that can be the past management history, the site conditions, our desired future conditions and management objectives, forest health issues, invasives, disturbance, revenue, recreation. There's all these things that we consider. And the work that we do at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science is really focused on adding climate change to that list of considerations so that there's not just one thing that you don't think about things differently because of climate change, but you integrate it in with all of these other considerations and add it as one more piece of the filter that you think about when you're making decisions. One of the projects that we do this with is called the Climate Change Response Framework, and some of you on the line are familiar with this, and it's really dedicated on getting from that piece of these big ideas related to climate science and climate change, which can be really overwhelming, and boiling it down to on-the-ground action. There's 4 different components. Partnerships are a really big part of it because we're all in this together. Climate change is a really tricky issue, and we really need to be working with our partners and collaborators to think about how to address it. I'm not going to talk about that piece too much, but we have these other components in terms of developing vulnerability assessments, developing adaptation resources, and adaptation demonstrations that I'm going to talk about today in terms of what our program looks like, and hopefully give you some ideas for how you can use these resources in your work and how you can reach out to us to get additional information so that you can do your jobs better. One of the things we do is develop vulnerability assessments, and so we cover the entire Midwest and Northeast in our work. I am the coordinator for our work in New England, even though I'm located in Upper Michigan. The weather is kind of similar here than where you guys are in Vermont right now. And we develop these eco-regionally based vulnerability assessments that help summarize the climate change information for a particular area. And these are really nice in that they're designed specifically for natural resource professionals. So they are summarizing the really complicated scientific literature that's out there, but they're doing it in a way that's more technical and more focused on the type of information you're going to need for developing management plans or integrating this into your work. So it's very focused. It's not too general like you would get for a public audience. It's really targeted on providing technical information for resource professionals. We focus on tree species and forest ecosystems in these assessments, and we examine a range of future climates. The idea is that we don't know exactly what climate change is going to hold for us in the future, but we have a good sense of the general trajectory, and so we look at the entire range of potential futures that are out there based on the science and think about how forests will change across that entire range and what things might make forests more or less vulnerable. We use that to evaluate key ecosystem vulnerabilities to climate change. And so we actually, for instance, in the New England region, we'll say how vulnerable are, say, spruce fir forests on average? How vulnerable are our northern hardwood forests? and give people a starting point to think about how that affects their own particular forests. We don't make recommendations or assess vulnerability related to things like changes in land use or policy. These are really meant to be the state of the science. Here's what we know now about how climate change will affect forests, and allow people to make decisions based on that information given their particular circumstances. As I mentioned, we're doing one of these for the New England and Northern New York region that I cover through my work, where we've been synthesizing the existing literature and climate change assessments that are out there. There's a lot of great information available for New England already. There's climate change assessments that have been done for the state of Vermont, and regionally there's really great information. We're trying to bring it all into one place so people can have that as a ready resource. And we're also incorporating new results from models projecting forest response to climate change. And so one of the reasons that we decided to do a new assessment when there were some that already exist is that there's a lot of new model results about how forests might change. So this is the topic of a different talk, and I'm not going to talk about it in detail, but some of these models that are out there include things like the Climate Change Tree Atlas, which tells us about suitable habitat for different tree species in the future. The model Linkages tells us about species establishment. So if a seed was dropped on bare ground, would it be likely to germinate and establish now versus at the end of the century? And then Landis is another model that gives us a sense of how does forest productivity and composition change over time, because it models those relationships between species. So this is some of the information that's included in the vulnerability assessment that's underway. I just got this through scientific review, and I've been able to post a pre-publication draft on the URL on the bottom of the screen for that NE assessment at our forestadaptation.org site. And this is really great because it's going to take a little bit before these print copies are available. We expect them to be published through the Forest Service as general technical reports later this fall or winter. But in the meantime, you can begin using this information. So I would definitely suggest that you go there and start to see what is available. There are also some recorded presentations focusing on the impact side of things if you're interested in that. So this is really great because this provides us a foundation of really good information to think about how we can inform our management. There's a lot of different information about climate change, and again, I'm not going to cover this in any sort of detail, but we recognize that there are challenges from climate change on forests, so things like reduced growth, the potential for moisture stress and drought as temperatures increase. We know that some of our northern and boreal species are projected to decline in the long term. They might be doing really well now, but as climate changes, they're going to be under greater stress. There's increasing disturbance from extreme events like extreme rain and also more storms. Wildfire potential may change. And then, of course, we have forest pests, diseases, invasive species, deer, things that are challenges now that are likely to become even greater challenges in the future as a result of a changing climate. But we also have opportunities, and we see this a lot, especially in some of the northern forests: increased productivity from a longer growing season, from more carbon dioxide or plant food in the atmosphere, and that some species might actually do better. And so, of course, these challenges and opportunities completely depend on your particular site and your management objectives, which is why we don't provide recommendations in our work. We know that you guys are the experts in terms of the particular places that you're working in, and you know what you need to achieve there. And so what we do is help provide you that extra information, that extra ideas for that thought bubble so that you can make better informed decisions for what you need to do. So this brings us to our adaptation work. So essentially when we're doing this, we're thinking about how do we adapt forests to changing conditions from climate and all the other things that go along with that, is we're asking a two-part question. We're asking, how can we enhance the ability of a system to cope with change, of a forest to be able to stay healthy as conditions change around it, while meeting our goals and objectives for management, for conservation, for stewardship? How do we bring those two together? Because we know that our landowners, whether it's an agency or a private landowner, has certain things they want to achieve. How do we make sure that they get there? And this is when we developed the forest adaptation resources. We actually developed a copy of this in 2012. You guys may have a copy. It's more of a dark green cover. I should have put it on here. And we recently re-released it this past fall as a second edition, and you can order that through the Forest Service Northern Research Station website if you want a paper copy or a PDF. But the idea of the forest adaptation resources is exactly that. It's adaptation resources to help support you in making these decisions. The vulnerability assessments provide the science information. The adaptation resources provide the tools for integrating it. So I'm going to describe this in a bit more detail. There's really two parts to it that I'm going to focus on. One is the adaptation strategies and approaches, which is a menu approach for adaptation actions. And then the other big part is an adaptation workbook, which is a structured process for helping think about climate change in your management. There's also a couple other parts to the forest adaptation resources that you might be interested in. And one, and I'll discuss this briefly at the end, is examples of how the workbook was used by different land management professionals across the Midwest and Northeast. And so not only do you have these two tools, but then there's also a chapter and some examples of how these were used in real-world situations. So the first part of this is the adaptation strategies and approaches. And we describe this as a menu. It's a list, but instead of it being a checklist where you're supposed to do everything, do this, do this, do this, everything on the list, it's this menu idea in that you pick and choose what you want based on what makes sense for you. So this is a list of actions that was based on the literature on climate change adaptation. So we looked at hundreds of papers. We brought in comments from natural resource professionals, from people specializing in climate change, and essentially saying, what are the different actions that are out there that managers can take to adapt forests to changing conditions? And we scoured the literature, got a lot of comments, got a lot of ideas, brainstormed, and then we sifted these into this menu of 10 strategies and 38 approaches. And the idea here is that the strategies and approaches provide an intermediate step from going to big ideas about responding to climate change down to the specific tactics of what you would do on the ground. And so the big ideas you often hear, and I'll talk about these, are really, things like building resilience. It sounds great, but it's really hard to say, what does that mean? The strategies start to get more specific in terms of ways that you could, say, build resilience. The approaches get yet more specific and give you an idea, starting off point for, what kinds of actions you could take. And then the tactics is the most specific. Those are the actions that you actually implement on the ground. And we don't actually tell you what those are. We can provide examples of those. There's a lot of examples in the adaptation strategies and approaches menu, but we stop short because we let you design those based on your particular condition and situation. So at the highest level, there are these ideas of options. Options are these big concepts for how to respond to climate change. And I think they're helpful because they give you a sense of the trajectory that you want to head. We know that climate change is going to change things in terms of where we are going. I'm being very redundant in my speaking. What I'm trying to say is that when we manage a forest, we have this idea of a desired future condition in our head. We know that we're trying, this picture in our mind of what we're trying to achieve, say 50 years or 100 years down the road. Where do we want to go? And climate change is going to make it, is pulling us in a different direction. It may make it more difficult to get where we want to go, and we don't know exactly where it's going to take us. So this framework allows us to decide, how are we going to approach that problem? Resistance is essentially playing defense. You're improving the defenses of the forest against change, and you're trying to maintain relatively unchanged conditions. So the idea here is you're saying, I know climate change is happening, but I want and potentially changing my forest, but it's really important that this forest is like it is now, or this ecosystem is how it is now. And it might take additional resources to keep it there, but I'm going to try really hard. I'm going to resist change. I'm going to keep it exactly how it is, or similar to how it is. An example outside of climate change would be pulling up invasives. The invasives are changing the forest, and so you put in this extra effort to pull them up, get rid of them, to keep the forest in its current condition. It's sort of the same idea, but with climate. Resilience is where you allow some degree of change, but the idea is that you can bounce back after a disturbance. And so to more or less the same condition. Ultimately, your ecosystem is going to be recognizable as the same thing. So if you're in northern hardwoods now, it's going to be northern hardwoods in the future, but it might be that you have a windstorm and it bounces back from that more readily. And I like to think of it as more like a rubber band. You stretch it, but it goes back to its original shape. And so we talk a lot about resilience, and resilience can mean a lot of things, but this is really where we focus on it, is you're thinking about how you enable a system to cope with disturbance, to cope with changes, to bounce back, and still be recognizable as the same system. And then lastly, there's transition, which is the idea that you're actually trying to figure out where the system is heading in the future and facilitate change and enable ecosystems to respond to new and changing conditions. So in this instance, what you have as a forest now might not be the same thing in the future. You're actually transitioning it to something different. Might be a little different, might be a lot different, but it would be noticeably different by, say, other professionals. So this helps, I think, in terms of if you're thinking about a particular place, identifying how you're going, where you're going to do resistance, where you're going to do transition. You might even do these different, you might take these different options and apply them in the same property, and that you might do resistance in one stand and you might do transition in another. You might build resilience, but have a backup plan for transition should a disturbance come that's just too big. So they're not completely, they're a continuum and you can mix and match them, but I think it's helpful to kind of just think about that question of, am I trying to prevent change and keep the system as it is, or am I actually trying to promote change, or under what situation would I do that? So from that big idea of options, then we go to strategies, and I realize this is messy, but I just wanted to give you a sense of these high-level 10 strategies that we have in the menu of adaptation strategies and approaches. And the idea here is that there's a mix of them, and you start to get a sense of the different type of actions that you would take under them. So for instance, under strategy 2, which is reduce existing biological stressors, there's a number of approaches underneath it. And so one of the approaches underneath it is to remove invasive species. So again, that's sort of like a resistance idea. Another one is to reduce the impacts of herbivory. Similarly, if you look under strategy, let's see, strategy 9, which tends to be more on that idea of resilience and even promoting transition. You see strategy 9 is facilitate species transitions. So there's approaches under that about promoting diversity of native species, about promoting species that are adapted to future conditions or to hotter and drier conditions. And so you can see that there's these strategies, and some of them are mutually exclusive, and that's why we have this menu, and that you can pick and choose what makes sense for you, but it helps you start to think about the different types of actions that you could take in a particular place. And you can view these online or through the Forest Adaptation Resources document. And so sometimes people ask us why we need this list, or why we push it in some ways, but I think the biggest idea is that the menu helps you create a clear rationale for your actions by connecting them to adaptation ideas. And so it really shows that thought bubble, that intentionality. You have thought about climate change. So for instance, let's say that you're working in a northern hardwood stand and you were thinking about maybe promoting a little bit of red oak, northern red oak, because you think it might be better adapted to future conditions. It might be a situation where if you just said, oh, I'm going to promote the red oak, people might not understand why you're doing that. But if you can connect it to the adaptation strategies and approaches and say, I'm promoting northern red oak because it's expected to do better under future conditions, because it helps diversify the site with native species and reduces its risk of other species declining, because if you can start to connect it to these other ideas, it shows that you have a good train of logic, and it helps people understand why you're taking that particular action, because it's not always, if you just look at the action, it's not necessarily clear why you're doing it. Another part of it is it actually helps you show success. And so if you're looking at thinking about, I'm going to maybe promote a little bit of northern red oak as one example to increase species diversity, to promote some species that might be better adapted to future conditions. It allows somebody to come back maybe in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years when you're gone, you're not working on that property, you're retired or whatever, and people can come back and evaluate, did the actions that they take help get them there? Did that make sense? And again, you're essentially showing your work. So that way somebody, your successor, can come back and see, did that make sense? Okay, so that's the adaptation strategies and approaches. The other component is an adaptation workbook. And this is to be used with the adaptation strategies and approaches and provides a structured process for how to think about climate change. And so essentially what we wanted to do is wanted to make adaptation, climate change adaptation, more digestible. And so what we did is we took what is essentially a planning process or an adaptive management process and thought about how do we break it down and put climate change into each of these steps, so that way you're not dealing with climate change all at once, but you're dealing with it in parallel to the sort of decision-making process that you would typically have. So it's a 5-step process. And so the first step is to define your area of interest, management objectives, and timeframes. This is just saying, where are you working and what are you trying to achieve? This is the same thing we do when we start out any management plan, any prescription. It's just, what's the situation on the ground? What are you trying to do in a particular place? And so you're just starting with that, which is absolutely fundamental. The next part is thinking about how climate change can affect that particular place that you're working. And so we know that, we might be able to say that climate change is going to have a certain effect across New England from something like the vulnerability assessment, scientific literature, other resources. We pull that information in and say, okay, climate change is going to affect New England, or climate change is going to affect Vermont this particular way. But we know that each site is different. And so this, in step 2, what we do is really think about what is unique about my particular site. And how is climate change going to affect it? How is it more or less vulnerable than the average? So this is something where you might say, okay, if extreme precipitation events are increasing across New England and Vermont, and this is something that we expect to continue, which it is, am I on a site with steep slopes and highly erodible soils that I need to be thinking about this? Or am I in a lowland where I'm susceptible to flooding where I need to be thinking about this? Or maybe you're in a flat upland and you don't need to. This is where you bring in your personal expertise and think about how climate change will affect the area that you're working in. The next step basically brings those objectives and your site and how climate change could affect it together into, steps 1 and 2, basically brings them together and says, okay, well, if I think about my goals and objectives and I think about how climate change is going to affect this particular place, what challenges or opportunities does that create for my management goals and objectives? Step 4 is the part that everyone wants to get to, which is what do I do about it? So if I know that these are my management challenges and opportunities under climate change, this is how I'm going to respond. And that's where we have people go and look at that menu of adaptation strategies and approaches and say, okay, given my situation, I'm looking to address this challenge and this challenge, so I'll use these strategies and these approaches. And then the last step, of course, is to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness and follow up and see if what you did made sense and was successful. So we can think about this because with climate change, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, and so we're in a situation where we have to learn by doing. And so monitoring is always important, but it can be really hard to do, and so it's more important to think about how those actions you took, how those are working out, so that way we can figure out how to address some of these really tricky issues. The workbook is in a couple different formats. If you use the Forest Adaptation Resources, it's available in a worksheet format. There's paper worksheets in the back of the Forest Adaptation Resources. We also have Word and Excel copies where you can go through and enter it in by hand. And then more recently, we've developed an online adaptation workbook tool that allows people to use this as well. And so this is a more interactive tool. It's nice in that it brings, if you specify your location, you drop a pin on a map and it brings in the information from the vulnerability assessment and other resources, brings it right in so you can just look and see what the climate change impacts are for your particular region and decide, do those make sense? How would you add to, modify, or remove them? And then it continues to walk you through that process. And so we did a lot of updates to the site this past fall. And we actually did a distance learning course called Forest Adaptation and Planning and Practices online with a number of people in New England this particular last winter, January through March, and they tested it, and it's been really workable. It does take, a number of hours to go through, but the really nice part is at the end, it actually provides you an adaptation plan for your property that you can include as an appendix or cut and paste to incorporate into a management plan. So by using the menu of adaptation strategies and approaches together with the adaptation workbook, essentially what we're doing is we're connecting the dots and we're showing a really great chain of logic that goes all the way from our management goals and objectives to the actions that we take on the ground. So this is important because it helps us, like I said, show our work. It makes it that we can think about all those things that are going to affect us in terms of climate change impacts, challenges, and opportunities, and the types of actions that are available. So that way we can feel really confident that the actions we're taking make a lot of sense for the area that we're working in, that we've considered them really well, and that we can move forward. And then also can provide that explanation to our colleagues, our coworkers, our bosses, our clients, and really help explain that all the way through. One thing I want to mention is it's not just forests. Our work has really come out of forestry and forestry and forest management, but we have been expanding these adaptation resources and our use of the adaptation workbook. We have the menu for forests currently, and that's been most of the work we've done, and particularly in New England. And when I talk about forests, a lot of that is silviculture in terms of forest management and timber harvest, but we've also had projects related to wildlife habitat, recreation, and other management objectives beyond just timber management. We also, in the new version of the Forest Adaptation Resources, the second edition update, we have a menu of strategies and approaches specifically for urban forests for anyone who's working in that. And then we also developed, working with the USDA Climate Hubs, a set of adaptation resources for agriculture. And so I don't know that that's so much for this particular audience, but it is available. And if you guys are working with, say, land trusts who have both agricultural and forest lands, it is available for agriculture as well. And those three menus of adaptation strategies and approaches and uses of the workbook have been incorporated into the online adaptation workbook. We're also working on developing these for more topics because people have found it really useful. And so one is for forested watersheds. We have a draft in progress, and we're actually having a workshop next week in Keene, New Hampshire to test that. So if anyone wants details, we have a few slots left. One that we're going to be working on more towards the summer and fall is really thinking about carbon management and what sorts of actions can we integrate so that we're not only adapting forests to climate change, but we're retaining their potential as greenhouse gas mitigation potential as well. And as this carries on, we're getting other interest in things like wildlife or tribes and cultural resources, and if you have ideas, we'd be really interested in talking with you about those. Great, so what I want to do is I realize that this can be a lot to digest, and it's hard to see how all of these pieces fit together when I just talk about the ideas. So I wanted to give a couple examples of projects that have considered climate change and integrated them in using our adaptation workbook. This has been a really big focus of our work over the last couple of years, is developing a network of what we call adaptation demonstrations. And so these are places where managers have used the adaptation workbook as part of their process for considering management on their land. So they might be considering climate change as part of a management plan, as part of a timber sale, but it could be part of just another project that they're doing that they're integrating. So anytime that people are thinking about deciding to take an action, they'll use the workbook, and we record those as stories, and I think that these are really helpful. You can see that we have a lot in the Northwoods of northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. That's where our work really started. We've been kind of expanding across the region and eastward since then. We actually have a couple more in New England that aren't represented on that map, especially in New York, but in New Hampshire, but really what these do is provide us a lot of useful information from different landowners, different project types of forest management activities that do those two things, enhancing the ability of forests to cope with changing conditions while achieving landowner management goals. One of the really great things we found is that these adaptation demonstrations foster cross-ownership dialogue and learning. And what that means is we used to give talks about climate change adaptation and the forest adaptation resources, and it was nice, but people didn't really know what to make the sense of it. But when we started to be able to have these examples of people who are using the workbook, of examples of foresters being able to say, this is what I did on my property or what I did on a particular property and why. When we started to be able to do field tours of these sites, that really picked up the speed at which people were able to use these resources, because all of a sudden you have examples, you have peers who are doing that, and there are a few folks on the phone today who've gone through that process, and I'd welcome them to talk about that when we are at the end for questions. And the other part is they just illustrate really diverse goals and approaches. And so if I guess flip back, you can see all the different types of ownerships that we work with. We don't just work on federal or state lands, but we work with all sorts of landowners. It doesn't matter who in particular will do that. And then each one of these has their own goals and objectives associated with that. And so it really helps to show that it's a flexible approach that can accommodate a really wide-ranging set of goals and approaches. Also, I'll say that those are, those projects range from on the order of, it might be a 20-acre timber sale up to tens of thousands of acres for something like a Forest Service vegetation management project. And so we have a lot of ability also to accommodate different scales of management in this. So one example, I have a couple. This one I'm going to go through in a little more detail just to kind of show you how that process works, and then I'll give you a couple more quick examples. So this example is with the Atlas Timberlands in Vermont. So this is the Vermont Land Trust, and a large tract of land that they acquired several years ago. And so this is a fairly typical, not atypical situation that we have in the region, where we have some of these post-industrial lands that are now being managed for a much broader array of goals related to broadly sustainability and conservation. So we want to do, working forests, but we also want to have a lot of other goals related to biodiversity and wildlife habitat, related to water quality, amenity values, maybe recreation. And so this was really kind of the purpose of this particular area, but then also, like I said, representative of other forests in the region. And so one of the things we wanted to think about on this particular project was, how do we adapt some of these particular lands in the Northern Green Mountains to climate change? And what we found that a lot of the management that they were currently doing, and this would be similar for a lot of the management that all of you are doing, is really good and has adaptation benefits. And so the purpose of that management wasn't to think about climate change, but because you're thinking long-term, because you're thinking about being good stewards of the land, you're doing a lot of important things that also have benefits when you think about the potential for climate change. So things like following BMPs for water quality is important for protecting water quality, and that just becomes that much more important when you think about extreme precipitation events and other changes. Same thing, increasing coarse woody material is wonderful for, wildlife habitat. But if you have that coarse woody material on the ground, it might help slow the flow of precipitation during extreme water events. It can help hold the moisture closer to the soil. So if we have hotter temperatures or drought, we are retaining moisture near the soil surface and protecting potentially our regeneration. They were already thinking about increasing tree species diversity, which becomes more important when you think about climate change. Structural diversity as well, because you're essentially spreading your risk. You're separating your eggs across multiple baskets. So if one species doesn't do well, if one particular age cohort doesn't do well or is hit by an extreme weather event, you have options available to you. Ensuring adequate seedling regeneration is really important when we think about having a future forest that's going to be able to cope with different events, controlling invasives, minimizing roads and trails. All these things are really common management activities that managers across the region undertake. They were undertaking on this property. And so, again, not necessarily different, but more important because of climate change. So when we thought about their particular site, one of the biggest challenges we thought about regarding climate change was this challenge of shorter and more variable winters and the challenges associated with forest harvest operations. And this is something that, many people are talking about even, this particular year with the variability of just conditions, the weather in a particular winter. It can make it really challenging to carry out your operations, and this is of course one of the best times of year to do it on a lot of sites, and only time you can do it on a lot of sites. So because they were doing a lot of great work in their forests and there weren't a lot of changes that we really saw they needed to make in their forests at this particular time, we decided, well, what can we do about attacking this issue related to shorter and more variable winters and needing to conduct a timber harvest? And so the idea was, well, let's try a summer harvest on what would be typically considered winter ground. And so there was two particular compartments. This one here where they had done the winter harvest. One winter there was an area that was essentially marked and ready to go for the following winter, but instead they worked with us, and we used a little bit of funding from the Forest Service for a small grant to help assist in thinking about, could we essentially do a summer harvest on what would typically be winter ground and is kind of marginal for a summer harvest, and what would the costs be associated with that, just to get a sense of what are some of these issues that we're going to be dealing with in the future, and how do we start to think about this. And so we did this on this particular site. It was able to be successful, but it involved a lot of extra costs and expenses, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I do have them in my files, because they ended up having to think a lot harder about road layout. There was a lot of more pre-sale and post-sale road work and that needed to be done to make sure that everything was going to be protected. And then a temporary bridge installation, which added a lot of cost to this particular project. So this is one example where they kind of, like I said, went through that process. Where are we working? What are we trying to achieve? How's climate change affecting our site? What challenges does that create? And what are we going to do about it? So this is one particular project. I'm just going to show you a couple more, but these are very short in terms of just a quick vignette to give you a sense of the type of projects that we've worked with, just a real small sampling. And so I would encourage you to go to our forestadaptation.org website, and you can actually read descriptions on all of these projects I'm going to present and more.
Maria, this is Kate, and,
Yeah.
and I know you have more demonstration projects to share, but a question did come in from John about, can this be used to project what will likely happen without any management?
In terms, so yeah, yes. Let me think. I will answer this, and then he can let me know if this answered it to what he was thinking about. So one of the things is, not managing, deciding to not manage is another form of management. And so, for instance, if you were to have goals related to in areas that were not going to be managed, so say protecting protecting areas of high conservation value or conservation lands where you didn't expect to do management, you can use this particular process to go through that and consider the risks and opportunities associated with that. And so a couple examples that we have, we've actually used this in a couple places where there were preserves that were on coastal islands, one in Maine and one in Rhode Island, where there were areas where a land trust had purchased land and was essentially had these islands, reserves on these islands in the ocean. And they went through this process and it helped them identify what are the issues associated with, say, things like sea level rise, coastal storms, forest degradation, invasive species, and what are the challenges and opportunities that they're going to have in the future. And in that, they identified, well, maybe we should do some management, but they don't have to. They were able to think about, if I kind of went with a no management, say, alternative, these are the challenges, the challenges and opportunities associated with that decision. Or, maybe we need to consider something that is a little more hands-on, and these were particularly degraded areas. Maybe we need to think about something more aggressive. This is what those actions might be. Now we have to start a conversation with our collaborators about that. Do you think that hit on that?
Yeah, I think so. And John, please let us know in the question box if you have any follow-up questions.
No, I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, a lot of it is coming at this, talking to forest managers, and background is the hands-on management, but you can use it for this process works even if you're thinking about areas that you don't want to do management or conservation lands where you might not be thinking about it. And it helps because it helps you evaluate the trade-offs in terms of, are you going to be hitting up against some kind of impact that is going to become more problematic in the future? Are you absorbing more risk maybe by doing no management, or maybe it's the other, maybe you actually have less risk, and that's good to think about too. I just have a couple more quick examples and we'll have plenty of time for questions. This one here is Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary, so it's on the Massachusetts-Connecticut border. So this is a wildlife sanctuary, it's privately owned, and so their focus is really on increasing diversity for wildlife habitat, and that involves areas where they aren't managing and involves areas where they are doing active forest management, both even-aged and uneven-aged. And so one particular area we were working on was looking at increasing tree species diversity and forest structure, and also reducing impacts from forest pests and diseases. So, pretty typical sort of situation. And really here we were trying to think about what actions could we demonstrate on this particular property that would also be applicable to private landowners in the region. This is a demonstration forest for a climate adaptation fund project funded through the Wildlife Conservation Society. And so here the management is really focused on promoting native species that are better adapted to future conditions. And so here we're looking at, can we do a thinning, can we do some group and patch cuts that are going to promote a wider diversity of species, that are going to promote maybe some more oak and hickory species that in that landscape we would expect to do better under future conditions, but they're also going to have wildlife benefits in terms of short-term, early successional structure, diversifying the forest structure, and then long-term things like mast production for oaks and hickories. Another example, right on the border of Vermont with Massachusetts, is one that we're working with Trout Unlimited and partners, and this is also kind of where our workshop in Keene next week is coming from, where we're really trying to think about how do we not only think about forest ecosystems, but think about forest infrastructure, about streams and hydrology within the context of a forest ecosystem. So here Trout Unlimited is working with a local land trust, and has working forest as well as some state forest lands. And they're really looking again at increasing tree species diversity and forest structure and reducing impacts from forest pests and diseases. We could probably say that about pretty much every forest that we ever work in. In this particular place though, if you look at the picture, you can see that we have a lot of conifers around a stream, and so we have a situation where we have riparian areas that have a lot of hemlock, and starting to show signs of decline associated with hemlock woolly adelgid. So what are our options for increasing the diversity, potentially working in riparian areas, which isn't something that we we always do a lot of, but maybe doing a little bit more active management within riparian areas in order to reduce the risk from hemlock, to diversify those stands, and so that way we can retain conifer cover for stream shading necessary for those streams to keep them nice and cold for trout and aquatic organisms. Then there's also a number of aspects of this particular project that are focused more on forest infrastructure. And so we have things like the other picture looking at road crossings and making sure that they are not only appropriately sized to handle extreme precipitation events, but also built in a way to facilitate connectivity for aquatic organism passage and for the quality of just the ecosystem itself. So this particular culvert was one that was washed out during Irene. It was replaced, but replaced urgently and not as well as it should have been. And so this particular area is going to be replaced, again with a actual bridge. There's another area where they had a woods road. It's only an access road for forestry operations, and they had a culvert that kept blowing out. And so right now half the culvert's blown out, and you kind of have to drive around to hit the one part of the culvert that's still there. And because they actually don't use that area so much, they're actually going to replace that, pull out that particular stream crossing, pull out the culvert, and rebuild it as a rock ford. And so that would be an example of, kind of this idea of enhancing the resilience of the stream to handle these extreme precipitation events, but actually transitioning it to something else, realizing that that culvert isn't doing anyone any good, the access is pretty minimal and only at certain times, so let's just put in a rock base on a stream so we can cross it occasionally and let it otherwise serve as a natural system. One project that we have is with the Nature Conservancy in Maine. This is in far northern Maine. Again, this is one where we're looking at tree species diversity and forest structure. The context here is they have a lot of formerly industrial lands that have been really reduced the softwood component, really reduced the conifer component as a result of repeated entries and past management. So you have these northern hardwoods that are missing a conifer component. And the idea is, can we restore a conifer component, but think about what conifers are going to do well on those sites, both now and in the future. So thinking about planting red and black spruce currently, but also white pine, which isn't currently in that part of Maine too much, but is expected to move north over time and be better adapted. And then Providence Water is another site where we're really looking at reducing impacts from forest pests. Same thing, pests and diseases. Here we had an idea place where there was actually a regeneration failure. The overstory died due to some pest outbreaks, and then the understory never regenerated, so we have a lot of brush and a really low level of regeneration. So here they're actually promoting future adapted species by planting southern species, and so there's active planting on these sites, including species that are farther south than what they would currently see. So black oak, pin oak, persimmon, pitch pine, shortleaf pine. And so this one is much more on that transition and active experimental sort of phase in terms of how far can we bring some of these species north, that we would expect maybe something more like New Jersey. How do we bring some of these species north in this area that's just been heavily impacted, where we're not getting regeneration, is incredibly droughty and has a lot of things going from it. There's also a herbivory component, managing herbivory component on that. So just to conclude, I want to point out that if you want a single answer for how to respond to climate change, I'm going to tell you that it depends. It depends on where you're working and what you're trying to achieve. And so, again, we don't provide recommendations. We help facilitate people through a process to think about what works for them. What we're finding through a bunch of all these projects is that most of the time it's the things that you're doing, if you're thinking about managing for the long term and you're being really aware, you guys are if you're participating in something like this webinar, is that the actions that you're taking for current management are going to be really important, and they just become that much more important. Your forest health issues, your invasives, your herbivory, all these things are just more important, and so you have to keep doing them. And so climate change adaptation isn't going to look like a giant departure for you. Then there's going to be these ideas of small tweaks. So can you do something a little bit different in terms of, say summer harvest instead of winter harvest? Can you increase diversity by maybe doing bigger patch cuts to get maybe some species that are a little bit more tolerant to hotter and drier conditions? So these tweaks. And then, there might be these things that you'll identify that are new and different or even seem wild and crazy. And you might take those now or you might just identify them for the future, but you don't necessarily have to. They're going to be a small component, and so it's not that managing for climate change is a complete 180 in terms of it. It's a lot of the same, and then just identifying these different opportunities in the right place and situation. So next time you're in the woods, I really encourage you to take a look and think about how climate change might affect your particular forest. Think about what's important here. How is it going to change right where you're standing? What are you doing to help? Give yourself credit for that. You guys are doing a lot of great work, and so make sure that you can, connect those dots in terms of these things that I'm doing are also good for climate change. And then what other actions can you do to help? And start thinking about those tweaks or those changes that you might make now or in the future. And with all of that, I will stop, and I guess we have a few minutes for questions. I can put up the details for that workshop as well in the chat box.
That would be great, Maria. And I just added a message in the chat box as well, just with your email address, and indicated that folks could contact you directly for more information. We do have one question in the question box that is asking for more information about the workshop. So then I see if folks can find the chat box there on your side panel. Maria just posted a URL to a website. I assume this is for more information on the workshop or to register.
Yep.
So great. So just to give folks a few minutes to enter in any questions that you have. Maria, there was a follow-up from John and said, yes, I was thinking about how the trade-offs that you had not considered might affect the system, particularly for those of us that may not be as up-to-date on the effects of climate change.
Okay. Can you repeat that? Do I need to follow?
Yeah, no, I think it's just a comment, that he's been thinking about how the trade-offs that you might not have considered might affect the system. So,
no, that's helpful. Thanks, Jen. And yeah, I think that one of the things about the workbook is you can essentially use it, if you're in a place like, let's say you're a state agency manager, or you just need, or federal, and you have to articulate something for the public, or if you just want to think through it yourself, you can essentially kind of create those alternative scenarios of, and it allows you to have that space of, okay, I can take this action and here are the pros and cons, or I can take this action, here are the pros and cons, and either think through that or actually document it if you're in a situation where that documentation is important.
That's great. Thanks, Maria, for sharing that. And I don't see any other questions at this time. I'll give folks another minute or so to enter in any questions. And in the meantime, Maria, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to present today. This sounds like it's a really incredible resource. So if folks haven't been to the website, I assume you can use the URL in the chat box. Again, Maria, you said it's www.forestadaptation.org. Is that the correct?
Yeah, that's pretty much where our main, all of our that's our climate change response framework site. So you can, by going there, you can get through in terms of seeing the adaptation demonstrations, learning about our workshops, and a lot of other things. Contact me if you need to get a hold of me that way at some point in the future, but that's the best place to reach us. And I guess one thing I'll say, if there's two, is just, my job is basically technical assistance, and so I didn't say that too well, but like, I help people do this, and so if you have questions about any of this, whether it's climate change impacts or how to integrate it into your work, that's my job, is to help you guys do that.
Awesome. Just a quick question, maybe / comment from Alan. Again, he said great presentation and thank you, but he was curious about publications or information to share with the general public about forests and climate change. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, it's one thing we've been working on. I will add one more link to this, in terms of that Norcross project that I mentioned, we've been working with American Forest Foundation to think about how to develop materials. We've really been focusing more on woodland owners than the general public, but we've been working on kind of translating some of the information that I presented into some resources for woodland owners, and actually been practicing talking to them and things. And so that MassCon project is one where we have some materials posted that you can take a look at. Those are for that Massachusetts, Connecticut area, but it's something, if we need to make them for Vermont, we can certainly do that, and I think they're generally applicable. I would also, give a shout out. I saw that, Nancy Patch and Charlie Hancock were, on the webinar, and so I know that they've been thinking about this in terms of some of the work in the Cold Hollow to Canada region as well, and we've been talking not so much recently, but a bit, and so they might have some ideas too.
That's great. Yeah, and I believe there's a website for that that initiative as well. Great. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, and so I appreciate again your time this morning, Maria, and sharing your information and all the research that you've been doing, as well as this great tool. I wanted to thank participants as well for taking the time to join us this morning. We are in the process of scheduling an April webinar, so stay tuned for more details. I will be sending out an email announcement hopefully in the next week or so with information on our next webinar. So in the meantime, thank you again, Maria. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning, and hope everybody has a good day. And again, thank you for taking the time to participate in the webinar this morning. So with that, thank you again, everybody, and have a good day.